Well, on the cover of the book, we have things that some people in our country here have probably never seen. The seal of MI6, which is the British equivalent of the CIA, right, the one that James Bond worked for, or MI5, which would be the British equivalent of the FBI. One of the things I show in here is that these agencies, between the U.S. and the British, these are the dominant forces in NATO intelligence. They, in particular MI5, had a policy in Northern Ireland of deliberate murder. And this is a deliberate policy which seems to have been accepted by the leaders of MI5 all the way up to Thatcher in number 10 Downing Street. This is the Finucane murder story, and the details are in the book, that MI5, according to an official report that was issued by a blue ribbon panel of the British government, MI5 deliberately sent out agent provocateur to murder leading Catholic activists as a means of trying to manage the situation in Northern Ireland and prevent things from getting out of British control. So there we have a case of absolutely documented state-sponsored false flag terrorism conspiracy that no amount of wishing can get out of the world.
Also, though, with regard to the strategy of tension and the bombings, particularly in Europe, which are post-World War II bombings, you do think that the United States government was very much involved, don't you? Or even more so than the British?
Well, absolutely. That NATO intelligence, as I say, is essentially the British and the U.S. acting together. So that's the way all this was done. By the way, a guy that I knew in Italy at the time, and I write about him in the introduction, and one of the members of the Italian government actually pointed out at the time of the Moro assassination, he said, look, de Gaulle kicked NATO out of France in 1966, and the French have been relatively free of the kind of terrorism that you have in Germany and Italy and Greece, where the NATO infrastructure was still very strong. So what he was suggesting was that if you kick out NATO, you won't have a terrorist problem, meaning terrorism comes from NATO intelligence. And I think this is exactly correct.
I didn't know that de Gaulle had kicked NATO out of France.
Sure, that was the speech, I guess, in 1964 or 1965, in which he said the NATO headquarters, which had been located near Paris, had to leave, and they moved it to Mons in Belgium, near Brussels, and it's stayed there until the present time. Plenty of terrorism in Belgium, too. But France got off relatively easily. They didn't have the kind of spectacular stuff that you had, the Moro assassination, or the various things that went on in Germany with planes being, Mogadishu and things of this sort. So, again, this is the historical continuity that you have to look at.
I see you have a chart here in one of your chapters called One Coup Per Year, USA, 1998 to 2005.
Yeah, we're in a very, very unstable situation because of the threatened collapse of the dollar, this terminal crisis of the Anglo-American imperialist system, and they're striving for world domination against China and Russia. We're extremely unstable. And one of the forms that takes is what I would call Weimar politics. Right? It looks increasingly like Germany in the early 1930s, when you have to think about what that means. Hitler coming in 1933, we may be a certain number of years from that. What I try to show here, I'll try to tick them off if I can remember them. In 1998, you have the impeachment of Clinton, which is a coup. It's a cold coup. In 1999, there's an attempt to convict Clinton and throw him out of office, which fails because of popular support. Interesting, not all coups succeed. Later on in 1999, though, there's another coup from a different quarter, you might say, the Principals Committee. This would be Gore, Albright, Cohen, General Shelton, and that famous Richard Clark that we can't forget, ordering the bombing of Serbia. That is a proxy war against Russia. I mean, people need to remember, World War I started when Russia tried to defend Serbia. You bomb Serbia, it's like bombing Russia, and that's exactly how that was understood in Russia at the time. So that was really done not by Clinton, but by this Principals Committee. Clinton basically had no power left. He had mortgaged everything, his whole soul, to avoid being ousted from the presidency. In 2000, of course, you've got the first stolen election by Bush. In 2001, you have the really big one, the 9/11 terror coup. In 2002, you have a coup against the Constitution, which is this war powers transfer, much denounced by Senator Byrd at the time, which essentially violates the Constitution, saying the president can declare war anytime he wants. The Congress has essentially transferred the power to declare war to the president. That's not what the Constitution says. You can't do that by statute. Then in 2003, the inevitable fruit of that, 2 years ago, Bush uses those powers to attack Iraq. 2004, I have an afterword about this. You could probably call it life under the invisible government, right? What does electoral politics look like in a country that is so completely run by invisible government intelligence agencies? The stolen election. My title there is not an election, but a CIA covert operation, and I try to show how this is pretty much the Bush family tradition, but this time much more blatant, the stealing of the election in Ohio, in Florida, the so-called red shift, the massive difference between the exit polls and the recorded results, which is essentially attributable to vote fraud in favor of Bush by a colossal mechanism that I try to at least sketch. And now here we are in 2005. What's going to be the coup this year? Well, you can imagine a wider war, the extension of the war into Iran. The U.S. is practically already at war with Iran, with drones and airplanes flying over, secret teams on the ground killing people and spying. Or maybe it's Syria, where we have to assume the same thing is going on. The U.S. is attempting to interfere in Lebanon. We've got CIA people power revolutions, the Cedar Revolution in Lebanon, the Orange Revolution in Ukraine. It's exactly the same thing, I'm afraid, despite whatever people may think. Georgia, the Roses. So that's one possibility, is a war coup. The other possibility is the so-called nuclear option, which would be a radical change in the rules of the Senate to outlaw the filibuster on judges, and once it's judges, probably anything else, making the Senate into a rubber stamp of the Republican Party bosses in the same way that the House already is. This is what Senator Byrd talked about when he came out and compared the Republican leadership of the Senate to Hitler, saying about 10 days ago that Hitler knew the value of maintaining the cloak of legality, that the Republicans were doing the same thing, but they were essentially trying to turn the law upside down and against itself so that they can simply ram things through without the traditional debate, which is such an important part of what the Senate is supposed to do, right? It's supposed to be that part of the government that says, wait a minute, let's see if wiser heads can prevail. So that would be another possible coup for 2005. Or, of course, ever lurking in the background, atomic, bacteriological, chemical, radiological terrorism of the kind that they seem to be talking about now in February and March, much more than they did, say, in November, December, or January. So that's always there as a possibility to provide a pretext for new police state measures. This, by the way, is just in terms of the theory. This is pure Leo Strauss and Carl Schmitt. This is exactly what the neocons write about. Carl Schmitt essentially says sovereignty means the ability to declare the state of siege and have a coup. So what we're doing is we're getting it kind of on the installment plan, but you can see these different steps, and it's getting to be more and more of a suffocating grip on the government.
If people wanted to reference Senator Anuya's remarks with regard to the secret government, where could they find copies of those remarks?
Well, the key quote is right in my book, so you get my book and you get that right on, I think, on the epigraph for the first chapter in the book.
Now, you have a section called Angel is Next. What do you mean by Angel is Next?
Look, this is the forgotten clue of 9/11, which it seems to me is the most important, because this is when the invisible government speaks. You may remember that at one point during the morning, about 10 o'clock probably on 9/11, a death threat against Bush came into the Secret Service saying, Angel is next. It essentially means Air Force One will be shot down as the next step in these developments. There's no doubt that this telephone call took place. It was confirmed by Cheney indirectly, Condoleezza Rice very directly, many other Republicans directly. Then later on, it was denied. They said, it was a confused or garbled message that came in. At the beginning, it seemed to serve Bush because it seemed to explain why he had gone from Florida to Louisiana to Nebraska. why he had been running across the country, right, scurrying away instead of taking up his position in Washington. But as time went on, that became less important, and what became more important was that with this little message, you're opening up the world of the secret government, which otherwise hardly appears.